Imagine this, the greatest empire in the world brought to its knees, not by war, not by famine, but by the whims of a 14-year-old boy. A boy draped in silk and gold, worshipping a god Rome had never known, standing on marble steps before senators twice his age, ordering them to bow to the sun. His name was Elagabalus, a teenage emperor who dared to make Rome worship his god and pay the price for it. This is not a story of victory. This is the story of obsession, blasphemy, and divine madness. A tale that shows how power, when placed in the wrong hands, can twist the fate of empires. The year was 218 AD. The Roman Empire was vast, stretching from the sands of Arabia to the misty forests of Britain. But behind the grandeur, Rome was bleeding. Civil wars, assassinations, and political schemes had shaken the empire to its core. The Severan Dynasty, once powerful under Emperor Septimius Severus and his son Caligula, was collapsing. Caligula had ruled with an iron fist, ruthless, unpredictable, but strong. Until one day, during a routine journey in Syria, he was cut down by his own guards. His blood stained the desert road, and with his death, chaos returned. In the shadows of Syria, whispers began to spread. The powerful Roman legions stationed in the east, hardened warriors loyal to the Severan bloodline, began to hear rumors. A boy, just 14 years old, claimed to be the rightful heir of Caligula. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, a priest from Emesa, Syria, and more importantly, the high priest of the sun god Elagabalus, the black stone deity worshipped by his family. But this boy was no ordinary youth. He was the nephew of Julia Misa, sister to Caligula's mother. Misa was a woman of terrifying intelligence, ambitious, calculating, and determined to restore her family's power. She saw opportunity in the chaos. She began whispering to the legions, "This boy is Caligula's son, the true blood of the Severans. The gods have chosen him." Whether it was truth or lie no longer mattered. Gold flowed from her hands. Promises were made. And soon, the Syrian legions, fierce and loyal, raised the boy on their shields, proclaiming him Emperor of Rome. At 14 years old, Elagabalus had become the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. But Elagabalus was not a Roman emperor in the traditional sense. He did not care for senates, laws, or the weight of imperial duty. His true loyalty lay elsewhere, in the blazing light of the sun. You see, before he was emperor, Elagabalus was the high priest of a Syrian deity known as Elagabal, a manifestation of the sun god, represented by a sacred black meteorite stone, believed to have fallen from the heavens. To his people, this god was the center of life, the cosmic fire that gave light to the universe. But to Rome, it was alien, even blasphemous. Yet Elagabalus saw himself as more than emperor. He believed he was the living embodiment of his god. He had been raised in temples filled with incense smoke, drums, and chanting. From a young age, he was taught that he was chosen by divine fire. When he arrived in Rome, he brought with him the black stone of Emesa, mounted on a golden chariot, drawn by white horses. He marched through the streets of the Eternal City, dressed in shining silk robes, while senators bowed their heads in confusion and fear. Behind him, musicians and priests sang in a strange tongue, and the people of Rome stared in disbelief. The boy had brought his god into the heart of Rome. The Romans had always tolerated many gods. They absorbed the deities of conquered lands, Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, even the gods of Gaul and Germania. But Elagabalus was different. He demanded supremacy. He ordered that his god, Elagabal, be placed above Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods. The sacred black stone was installed in a magnificent new temple, the Elagabalus, built on the Palatine Hill, overlooking the imperial palace. Every morning, Elagabalus would emerge in shimmering robes of gold and purple, his face painted with divine symbols. He would lead processions through the streets, sacrificing animals by the hundreds, while drums and cymbals echoed through the Capitol. The senators watched in horror. The people whispered. Rome, the city of discipline and order, had become the stage for a foreign cult led by a child. But the emperor was unmoved. In his eyes, Rome's gods were inferior. He ordered that the most sacred relics of the Roman faith, the shields of Mars, the fire of Vesta, even the Palladium, be gathered and brought to the Elagabalus. There, he declared that all gods of Rome must bow before the sun. It was not just a change in religion. It was an insult, a provocation, and a threat to the very soul of Rome. But what happened next would push the empire beyond disbelief into outrage. In his desire to merge the Syrian and Roman religions, Elagabalus decided he needed to unite his god with the most sacred symbol of Rome, Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and purity. And so, in one of the most scandalous acts in Roman history, he ordered the marriage of his god, symbolized by the black stone, to Aquila Severa, a Vestal Virgin. To understand the magnitude of this act, you must know this. Vestal virgins were sworn to chastity for 30 years. Breaking that vow was not merely a sin, it was treason against the gods. The punishment was death, being married alive. And yet, Elagabalus, the boy emperor, summoned the young Vestal to his palace, declared her his wife, and announced that their union would bless Rome with divine children, offspring of the sun and the sacred flame. The city was horrified. The Senate trembled. Even his grandmother, Julia Misa, who had engineered his rise, began to realize the monster she had unleashed. But Elagabalus was untouchable, at least for now. The legions still obeyed. The priests still bowed. And in his marble temple, beneath the blazing Syrian sun, he believed himself the eternal God of the world. But power built on madness never lasts. Behind the golden walls of the palace, whispers of rebellion began to grow. His generals despised him. The people mocked him. Even his own family began to plot in secret. Because soon, the boy who made Rome bow to the sun would find himself in the darkness. The palace of Rome had seen emperors of all kinds, warriors, philosophers, and tyrants, but never a god. At least, that's what Elagabalus believed himself to be. He was no longer the trembling boy who arrived from Syria. Now he ruled the empire as the incarnation of the sun. His eyes were painted with gold dust. His robes shimmered like fire. Each morning, he would stand before the mirror, anointed in perfumes worth more than a senator's fortune, whispering prayers in a language none of his attendants understood. Then, as the horns of the temple blared, he would rise, step out into the sunlight, and begin his daily ritual. The emperor would lead sacrifices, not of one animal, but of hundreds. Bulls, sheep, and birds were slaughtered until the marble floors ran red, the air filled with incense and the chanting of Syrian hymns. And above it all, Elagabalus danced, graceful, entranced, possessed by what he called the light of heaven. To his followers, he was divine. To everyone else, he was insane. Elagabalus's cult grew larger each day. He ordered that the most important men of Rome attend his ceremonies, senators, generals, and priests. Refusal was unthinkable. Inside the Elagabalus, they were forced to watch as the emperor performed strange rites, pouring wine over the black meteorite, singing in Syrian verses, and sometimes even stripping to his robes, claiming the sun demanded purity of flesh. The old Roman nobility, men whose ancestors had fought Hannibal and conquered Gaul, now stood in silence before a teenager dancing to foreign drums. To the soldiers, this was not the Rome they had bled for. To the Senate, this was blasphemy wearing a crown. But to Elagabalus, this was destiny. He declared that all faiths, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, were merely reflections of his god. The sun was the true deity of the universe. He demanded that the people of Rome worship him not just as emperor, but his priest can profit of light. He even ordered that every coin minted in Rome bear his god's image, a black stone surrounded by rays of fire. For the first time in history, the image of the emperor was not on the empire's currency. Instead, it was replaced by the symbol of Elagabalus. To the Romans, it was unthinkable. But Elagabalus saw it as divine order, the world finally bending to his will. But power and divinity were not enough for the young emperor. He sought to experience everything, pleasure, excess, and transformation. At night, the same emperor who had paraded as a god by day would throw feasts that shocked even Rome's most jaded citizens. The palace turned into a theater of indulgence. The tables overflowed with gold, pearls, and exotic dishes from across the empire. Guests were showered with rose petals until some suffocated beneath the fragrant avalanche. He would dine until sunrise, laughing as musicians played and dancers swirled in silks. Rumors spread that he held banquets where guests were served only air, forced to pretend they were eating as he laughed from his jeweled throne. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, who witnessed his reign, wrote that never before had the world seen such disgrace under the name of emperor. Elagabalus ignored them all. Elagabalus's disregard for Roman values became a daily spectacle. He mocked the traditions that once made Rome strong: discipline, duty, restraint. He appointed chariot racers and dancers to positions of government. He made a chef consul for a day. He replaced the symbols of power with trinkets of pleasure. He even ordered that senators attend meetings dressed in festive garlands, as though the empire itself were one long banquet. When generals tried to speak of frontier wars, he dismissed them. "The sun will protect Rome," he said. The empire began to crumble under his neglect. Barbarians tested the borders. Governors plotted rebellion, and the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, grew restless. Behind his back, soldiers mocked him. They called him the boy priest, the mad son, and the false god. But Elagabalus either did not know or did not care. He believed himself eternal. And yet, the very people who once lifted him on their shields now began to sharpen their blades. His grandmother, Julia Misa, the mastermind who had brought him to power, watched the empire unravel. Her family name was now a curse. She realized that her grandson's madness threatened not only Rome, but her own survival. Beside her was another grandson, Alexander Severus, a quiet, intelligent boy, calm where Elagabalus was chaotic. The Praetorians began to look at Alexander with hope. He was a Severan by blood, but unlike Elagabalus, he behaved like a Roman. Whispers turned into plans. Julia Misa began to shift her loyalty. She presented Alexander to the Praetorians as a possible co-emperor, a stabilizing figure to balance the boy god's insanity. Elagabalus sensed the betrayal. He stormed into the Senate, accusing the generals and his grandmother of conspiracy. He had his cousin dragged before him and shouted, "There is room for only one god in Rome, and that is me." But the gods, it seemed, had already chosen their side. By the end of 221 AD, Elagabalus's empire was collapsing, not from invasion, but from within. Riots broke out. His soldiers refused orders. The Praetorians, once his protectors, now guarded Alexander instead. The boy emperor, once adored by the legions of Syria, was now a prisoner of his own palace, surrounded by luxury, yet haunted by paranoia. He spent hours locked inside his temple, praying to the sun, begging for signs. He burned incense until the air grew thick and suffocating. He would look into the sacred stone and ask why the god he served had turned away. But silence answered him. The emperor who had declared himself immortal now feared death. He stopped appearing in public. His banquets grew smaller, his laughter quieter. Even his priests began to disappear, arrested or executed in the night. The once blinding light of the sun god was fading into shadow. And so, the boy who once commanded Rome to worship him now sat alone in his palace, his power melting away like wax beneath the very sun he claimed to control. But his story was not yet over. The gods of Rome demand balance. And when arrogance defies the heavens, the fall is always brutal. In the next part, betrayal will come from within his own blood, and the sun god of Rome will be extinguished forever. By the beginning of AD 222, the once radiant sun of Emperor Elagabalus had dimmed to a flickering ember. The marble halls that once rang with music and laughter were silent now, haunted by whispers and fear. The same Praetorian guards who had once carried him through Rome's streets as a divine prince now watched him with hollow eyes, their loyalty purchased by his grandmother's gold. Even the senators, who had endured his madness in trembling silence, now prayed for his downfall. But perhaps the most dangerous threat of all was the one sitting beside him at dinner, his cousin, Alexander Severus. Alexander was everything Elagabalus was not: modest, disciplined, and deeply Roman. While Elagabalus adorned himself with jewels and perfumes, Alexander studied philosophy and governance. He listened to his grandmother Julia Misa, who quietly built his reputation as the savior of Rome. In the streets, whispers spread like wildfire. Alexander will bring back order. Alexander is the true Severan. Alexander, not Elagabalus, is the emperor we need. To Elagabalus, those words were daggers. The boy who had once made Rome bow to his god now felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The sun god was losing his light. Elagabalus could no longer sleep. Every creak of the palace made him think of betrayal. He saw enemies in every shadow, every whisper, every loyal face. He began purging his court. Advisors vanished overnight. Priests who had once praised his divinity were dragged away for insulting the sun. He even dismissed members of the Praetorian Guard and replaced them with men from his homeland, Syrians who shared his faith. But it was too late. The Praetorians, insulted and humiliated, began plotting openly. Julia Misa knew the time had come. She arranged a meeting, a family gathering inside the palace. Elagabalus and Alexander would appear together before the guard. She said, to show unity. But it was not unity that awaited them. It was judgment. It was a cold morning in March, AD 222, when the palace gates opened to the sound of marching feet. The Praetorians, armed and grim, surrounded the imperial courtyard. Elagabalus appeared first, radiant in gold robes, a crown of jewels on his head. Beside him walked Alexander, in plain white, eyes downcast. Julia Misa stood between them, silent. The emperor smiled, but his smile trembled. He tried to speak, to command his guards as he once had, but their faces were blank. Their hands rested on their swords. In desperation, he pointed to Alexander. "Kill him," he shouted. "He conspires against your emperor, against your god." No one moved. The silence was absolute. Then one voice spoke, a Praetorian centurion. "No," he said. "Rome has only one emperor now." And in that instant, Elagabalus knew the sun had set. Panic seized him. He turned and fled through the marble corridors of the palace, his golden sandals slipping on the floor. His mother, Julia Soenias, ran after him, screaming for the guards to stop. They fled to the Elagabalium, his sacred temple. There, beneath the black meteorite of his god, he fell to his knees. He prayed aloud, tears running down his painted cheeks. "Great Elagabal, light of heaven, save your son. Blind my enemies, burn them with your flame." But no light came, only the sound of soldiers breaking through the temple doors. He tried to hide behind the altar. His mother clung to him, begging for mercy. But mercy is rare in Rome. The soldiers burst in, swords drawn, faces hard. The emperor screamed, "I am your god." But the Praetorians had heard enough of gods. They dragged him out by his jeweled robes. His mother fought like a lioness, striking and clawing, until a blade silenced her. Elagabalus, the boy who made Rome worship the sun, was butchered in the sacred temple he built for his god. His golden robes were torn. His body, just 16 years old, was mutilated and thrown into the mud outside the palace gates. The soldiers, in rage and mockery, dragged his corpse through the streets, a trail of blood and jewels staining the stones of Rome. They spat upon him, struck him with boots and spears, until there was nothing left of the god-king but a broken boy. Then, in one final act of vengeance, they dumped his body into the Tiber River, the burial place for Rome's disgraced. The sun god had drowned. When the storm ended, Alexander Severus was proclaimed emperor. He was only 13, younger than Elagabalus when he had first taken power, but infinitely wiser. Julia Misa ruled behind the scenes, restoring dignity and peace. The black stone of the sun god was quietly sent back to Syria, never to return to Rome. The Elagabalus was cleansed, its altars torn down, and Jupiter was once again the lord of the Roman sky. Rome had survived another madness, but it would never forget. For centuries after, the name Elagabalus became a warning, whispered in the halls of power. He was the emperor who thought himself divine, who placed his will above Rome's, who tried to replace tradition with obsession. To some, he was a monster. To others, a tragic soul, a child thrown into the fires of empire, consumed by his own illusion of godhood. He ruled for only 4 years, but in that short time, he burned brighter and more destructively than almost any emperor before him. Even the historians who despised him could not look away. Cassius Dio wrote, "He was not merely a destroyer of laws and customs, but of the very nature of man. The boy who thought he was the sun left behind only ashes." But the story of Elagabalus does not end with his death, because what he represented, the clash of old gods and new faiths, the battle between Rome and the East, between reason and divinity, would echo for centuries to come. In the next and final part, we explore the legacy of Elagabalus, how his short reign reshaped Roman religion, scandalized history, and foreshadowed the rise of something even greater, a new god that would one day conquer Rome itself. Rome had seen many emperors rise and fall. Some built empires, some destroyed them, but none burned as brightly or as strangely as the boy they called Elagabalus. After his death, the empire did what Rome always did best. It erased him. His statues were smashed. His name was chiseled out of inscriptions. His memory was cursed under the ancient Roman practice of damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. It was as if he had never existed, but memory is a tricky thing. You can silence a name, but not the echo it leaves behind. Under Alexander Severus, Rome began to heal. The temples were restored. The Senate breathed again. The army returned to its discipline. Julia Maesa and her daughter Julia Mamaea, now the power behind the throne, made sure that Elagabalus's chaos was never repeated. But something had changed in the Roman soul. For years, Elagabalus's cult of the sun had scandalized the empire. Yet, the idea of a single supreme god had taken root. It was an idea that Rome would not easily forget. Less than a century later, emperors like Aurelian and Constantine would embrace the concept of one divine power above all others. Aurelian, in particular, created a new state religion dedicated to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, directly inspired by the god of Elagabalus. The irony was inescapable. The same Rome that had murdered the boy who worshipped the sun would, within a generation, build temples in its honor. And even later, as Christianity rose, its imagery of divine light, resurrection, and eternal life carried traces of that same solar worship. Elagabalus, the boy heretic, had planted a seed, one that would grow long after his body was thrown into the Tiber. To the philosophers of later ages, Elagabalus's story was more than history. It was a parable, a warning about the collision between faith, identity, and power. He was not a conqueror. He was a symbol, a child given the throne of the world before he could understand it, consumed by visions of godhood and immortality. He believed he could merge east and west, mortal and divine, male and female, that he could remake Rome in his image. But in trying to become everything, he became nothing. His reign revealed a truth that echoes even today. When a leader confuses personal belief with destiny, an empire can fall in the name of a dream. Beneath the layers of silk and madness, there was still a boy raised to believe he was chosen by the heavens. Imagine being 14, told by armies and priests that you were divine, that the fate of the world rested in your hands. What would that do to your mind, to your soul? Perhaps Elagabalus was not born mad. Perhaps he was shaped by a world that worshipped power above all else. He grew up in temples, surrounded by incense and prophecy, and when Rome placed the crown on his head, he mistook worship for love and obedience for faith. In the end, he was not a villain. He was a mirror. He reflected Rome's own excess, its arrogance, its hunger for spectacle. The empire that created gods out of men had finally created one that believed it. Centuries later, historians still argue about Elagabalus. Was he a monster? A mystic? A misunderstood visionary ahead of his time? Some modern scholars see in him an early expression of identity beyond traditional gender and religion, a figure who defied the boundaries of his age. Others see only chaos, a tyrant who nearly destroyed the empire. But there's no denying one thing. He was different. And in a world where conformity was worshipped, difference was the ultimate sin. He challenged the gods, the Senate, and the soul of Rome. And though he lost, his defiance carved a scar across history that never healed. By the 4th century A.D., long after Elagabalus's bones had turned to dust, the Roman Empire stood once more at a crossroads of faith. Emperor Constantine the Great, before converting to Christianity, worshipped the sun. He carried the title Sol Invictus. When he saw a vision of the cross shining like the sun before his great victory, he merged both symbols, light and salvation, into one. And so, the religion that would one day conquer Rome, Christianity, rose from the ashes of old sun cults. The light that Elagabalus once worshipped did not die. It simply changed its name. If there's one lesson from the rise and fall of Elagabalus, it's this. Power without wisdom is a flame that consumes everything, even the one who holds it. Rome thought it could make gods out of mortals. But every time it tried, the gods demanded a price. Elagabalus was not the first emperor to die by betrayal, nor the last to believe he was divine. But he remains the most haunting. Because in his story, we see the boundless hunger of the human spirit, the desire to become more than what we are, to reach for heaven, even if it burns us. And in that sense, perhaps the boy who worshipped the sun did touch something eternal. For as long as his story is told, his light still flickers. When night falls over the ruins of Rome, the Palatine Hill still whispers. Some say that when the dawn breaks and the first rays of sunlight strike the ancient stones of the Elagabalus, you can feel his presence, faint but unbroken. A reminder that even in madness, even in ruin, humanity has always chased the light. Because deep down, every empire, every ruler, every soul that ever lived is still trying to catch the sun. If you found this story of the teen emperor and the sun god as haunting and fascinating as we did, make sure you subscribe for more incredible true stories from ancient history, tales of power, faith, and the rise and fall of empires. Tell us in the comments, do you think Elagabalus was a mad tyrant or a misunderstood visionary ahead of his time? Your thoughts might just spark the next great discussion about Rome's most mysterious emperor. Until next time, remember this. Even the brightest light can burn itself out.